Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Let's take a look at the plan of Lagos State government to ban single-use plastics such as PET bottles and sachet water from January 2025. Femi, you are aware that sachet water is like what the common man is able to afford most
What is
times.
popularly known as pure water.
What is popularly known as pure water,
But
yes.
it's sachet water anyway.
Yes. So, yeah, because if you go to a shop
Yeah.
outside or maybe a nearby shop or even in the market area and you say, I need sachet water, some might just be looking at you like,
Where
what
are you
asking?"
from?
And they tell you, we don't have it. Meanwhile, they have it
Yeah,
there.
that's it.
So, but you say pure water,
Yeah.
we understand
That's what
it
they're
is,
used to.
what they mean. So, sometime in the year, Lagos State government also banned the use of styrofoam, and that was even used for used by food vendors to sell food, to package food. Now it's moved on to single-use plastic. What do you think is going to be the effect on the average Lagosian?
Well, that is predictable. You know, what you call single-use plastic materials like the styrofoam in Lagos is what you call takeaway. If I may use the common language, the ideal language for is sachet water, but what is commonly used is pure water. So the ideal word also is styrofoam or plastics, but what is commonly called is takeaway. So you observe that when people buy foods, these things are served in these materials and likely it's been in use for years, get to Lagos, Ogun State. But the essence of doing this is to ensure that the plastic waste is not constituting nuisance to the environment, the impact on the environment and then humanity. Now, this kind of thing started, in fact, it started early this year, around January 2024, but they are doing what you call systemic implementation of this plan. Now, the essence of doing that is to ensure that the people who are using this, you must understand that there are people who are in businesses because of these materials. And so they are trying to put human face
whose business depend on
that, to survive. So what the ripple effect of that is predictable. There are certain people who will lose their job, their income. There are companies who are specialized in producing these materials. I know a lot of them who are established in Ogun State and Lagos because these products are in high demand in Lagos State and Ogun State, most importantly. And so what that will mean is they might need to re-strategize so that they can stay in business, maybe divest into other materials, other plastic materials that will be useful. Because once this ban goes into effect, it means that the demand will reduce. In fact, the demand might get to zero in a matter of time, since the market for it is Lagos and even Ogun State. So by the time you have this kind of ban in place, these people need to put strategy in place to ensure that they stay in business. And that's why the Lagos State government is also doing it in phases so that people can be well informed. The awareness is there. They ought to have started January this year, but some stakeholders prevailed on them to give them more time to ensure that the full implementation is going to start. And now the full implementation is going to start in January next year. So once that is in place, bet with me, the common, what you call takeaway and pure water. But people will now have to re-strategize.
My worry is the possibility of many people being able to afford potable water, because sachet water or pure water, as it's commonly called, it's like the closest.
It's cheaper, affordable.
Yes, the closest to what the people can afford when it comes to having potable water to drink. So if you phase out sachet water, except there is some other eco-friendly material to contain water in small quantities like that many people can afford, I think it's also going to be a problem.
This brings to me a comment I read a few days ago where someone said, why is it that government is always quick to ban things that affect the common people or the masses? You're aware that the sachet water is cheaper, it's affordable for people. Even in traffic, people easily get that because between 50 to 100
water in PET bottles,
it's quite expensive. And so But the idea is this is where orientation is important. And if people are aware of the essence of doing it, it's not just what you're doing, but the stakeholders, the people who are going to be affected, they need to understand why this is
Even if they
important.
understand, do their
Yeah.
pockets understand?
Well, that's another thing. The fact that the economic, the purchasing power is being eroded. Because why people go for sachet water is because it's an
cheaper.
alternative. You understand? People will argue, okay, it's not the same content because depending on whoever is producing or where you are buying in it. But packaging is not important to some people. What's
It's
more
about
important is the
affordability.
content. Is the content and then the affordability. You're talking about water here. Some will say, okay, hey, let me provide another alternative. But what is more important is, I like the approach the Lagos state government is deployed into this. You're doing it in phases so that people will understand, so that the ripple effect or the kind of resistance that should come with these things will be defeated. So if you give people like 1 year to prepare for the takeoff, I think is enough.
I think to add to the awareness, Lagos state government should also let people know what alternative they're providing or are there for them to be able to have access to potable water to drink. We don't want people returning to drinking water from wells, from sources that are not good enough for them. There is even the question of the sachet water or the so-called pure water. How clean is it? How healthy is it for consumption? And
we have
to have it out of the reach of these people would be another problem. So I think in addition to the gradual phasing out of those sachet water, there should be a plan that people are aware of, that when this is phased out by 2025, you can still have access to cheap water that is stored or contained in an eco-friendly container, something like that, so that people don't feel like, what happens here is it that the common man cannot breathe? You know what the president said, let the poor breathe. And in breathing, let's move now to Uganda. What's happening in Uganda as the World Bank aims to protect projects in Uganda against the anti-LGBTQ law. Sometime last year, a bill that prohibits homosexuality in Uganda was enacted, and consequently, some projects, some funding were suspended from getting to Uganda. But the World Bank is saying that it has mitigation measures to ensure that projects in Uganda are protected. That's a business and policy expert who joins us virtually. Is Dr. Ken Ikenwa. Good morning and welcome to El Exchange.
Good morning, Blessing. Good morning, Femi. It's nice being with you guys again, though virtually. I actually miss being in the studio, but we have to do this. Thanks for having me on.
This is the first time that you're joining the show virtually. You've always been present in the studio.
Yes, this is the first time. So I'm going to write that date down on my diary. And I hope that the energy architecture and infrastructure in Nigeria will not disappoint us and send the wrong vibes out there. So right now, the electric companies are performing a little bit below average, a little bit above average. So let this be a litmus test for them. Let them keep us on.
But the energy exuding from your voice is very, very strong, and we hope that will take us through the show. I like your enthusiasm this morning.
Thank you very much. To God be the glory.
Let's get into the conversation. So, sometime last year when Uganda actually enacted a law against homosexuality or homosexual activities in the country, there were reactions from the international community against it. And consequently, some funding was suspended. So Uganda had to struggle. But the World Bank is saying that it is bringing or putting up mitigation measures so that projects in Uganda will be protected. What's your take on Uganda's stand against homosexuality and the reaction that greeted that law from the international community and the consequences that followed?
All right. LGBTQ, PRT plus XYZ. The acronyms continue to expand by the day. My perspectives are very straight, hard, and tight on this issue. First and foremost, I am an African Homo sapien. Espiritus Ben Elohim. I am an African that is human, that is a spirit being and a son of God. I am, by my spiritual orientation, a Christian. With or without that orientation, my views about the LGBTQ is very clear. And I know that those at the international embassies will have a glimpse of this video. I'm not scared. If you decide to deny me of a visa, deny me of entry into your countries, my goal is to die at a ripe old age and possibly make heaven. Let's come back to the strategic aspect of the discourse. The issue is this. One, that borders on what is the African culture. Two, that borders on why do we have the neo-colonial imperialist tendencies for external foreign powers to try to force on us, foist on us, cajole us, coerce us as the oldest continent, possibly, in the universe, to want to adjust, accommodate their own lifestyles. I find it utterly bemusing to think that for the fact that African leaders in the last 200 years not only sold out their own, but have gained independence and consistently mismanaged their economies, now have to run cup in hand, begging for aids and grants for their economies to be sustained. To now use the LGBT laws, anti-laws, against the countries that have taken their stand, that they do not want this to be institutionalized in their countries, it actually begs the question, is Africa really free? But going forward, issues and incidences like this, having sociological and psycho-spiritual ramifications, should begin to make Africa and African leaders ask questions. How do we get ourselves out of the grips and the grabs of the Bretton Woods institution and also of these Paris Club and other countries that have made themselves lords, neo-colonial lords over African countries and have made our economies their own enclaves? These are questions that should bother the oncoming generation, but I don't see even how the oncoming generation will solve this problem because they seem to be, in the language of the Gen Zs, jiving with the flow.
All right, Dr. Ken, good to see you again. It's been a while. You know, I like the touch of black. Blessing has said it earlier that we're black men, and so we're living up to that. Now, that's not just to tone down the seriousness that should be attached to this conversation, but I want us to address it on the part of the economic value, the business value, the impact on the projects going on in Uganda, not just from the religious angle. Now, let's look at the fact that the World Bank has insisted that the aim of doing this is to protect the beneficiaries of these projects. Now, there are certain projects that have been listed to have been sponsored by the World Bank. Aren't you bothered that this issue is also going to affect the kind of economic value and businesses that should take place in Uganda? And how do you expect the World Bank to handle this kind of sensitive issue in an environment, in a conservative environment like Uganda? Talk to us, please.
All right. It's good that you acknowledge that we've given an analysis of this subject matter from the spiritual perspective, the psychocultural perspective, which we cannot neglect because man is a tripartite being. I'm sure you've never seen this spiritual angle to me before. But most importantly, man is also a rational economic being, according to Adam Smith, who has to eat. And he most likely would think with his stomach before even thinking with his spirit or thinking about heaven or hell. All right. Truth be told, there is no doubt, there is no beating about the bush, that the kind of power that some of these institutions and countries hold when it comes to going against countries that have stood against the LGBTQ propaganda is quite enormous. And for Africans that have not been able to organize themselves since the first entry of colonial powers into Africa, especially the subcontinent, sub-Saharan continent, it would have an enormous burden on these economies. But if we face the subject matter, like I've said, whilst it will affect the growth, whilst it will affect the development potential of Uganda, it is also important that I bring us to some very, very most recent current data and statistics that Uganda is amongst one of the first 5 or first 7 growing economies in the world. And then if you go to some of the countries in Africa who have legalized and institutionalized and embraced the LGBT agenda, those countries are not doing well economically. And I'm not going to mention names. Those countries have the highest cases of HIV infections. They have the highest cases of rape. They have the highest cases of murder on a daily basis. So we cannot divide economics from morality, whether we like it or not. I was telling a very, very close person to my heart recently, a student of mine, that you have to be able to articulate your values, because your values would determine the value that you would sell out to others and the value that people will perceive about you. So much more than the economics, much more than the profit and loss, much more than the businesses that were affected, if we look at the longer term benefits and the need for us to organize ourselves, the need for the Ugandans to organize themselves, and the growth rate that they're experiencing presently, I do not think that the trade-off will eventually be on the worst side for Uganda. But let's see how this goes. But don't forget, those who have embraced this agenda are having issues in their country. And so those who have refused to embrace it may not also be countries that will not have issues, but they have also shown that with resilience and with focus, they can achieve economic growth and economic development without external interferences.
If we look at the African continent, Uganda is not the first country to have an anti-LGBTQ law. Even Nigeria has that. But the issue here with some of the international communities seems to be the severity of the anti-LGBTQ law. For Nigeria, it is 14 years imprisonment if you're found guilty of homosexuality or what's is around that. But for Uganda, it could be life imprisonment. It could even be death penalty. And so some donor agencies, some investors have withdrawn from investing in Uganda or having funds go to Uganda. The law seems to target LGBTQ pro organizations. What are your thoughts on this? Is it too extreme for Uganda going that way?
Well, laws are made by men, and men determine what extent and what gravity should be meted out to those who violate the laws. But we also hope that those who actually make these laws are not themselves guilty of violating the laws they have made to control the larger segments of society and to promote a social contract by indirectly or invisibly breaking those laws somehow at night. Now, the severity of the punishment that goes for indulging in these activities, for example, in Nigeria, is 14 years imprisonment. But it's also amazing that in my scholarship over the years and in monitoring this issue, I cannot tell you single-handedly in my dear country, Nigeria, any particular case in law, any particular incident, any judgment, any judicial precedent that is existing in Nigeria today that we can cite as one of those cases where people have been sentenced to prison in Nigeria for being found of indulging in sodomy or being found of indulging in LGBT acts. So on a larger picture, let's have a larger perspective on the subject matter. If you say that a country is free, if you say that a country is a sovereign country, should you, because of your advanced economic status and because of the wealth that you have stolen so much from Africa, use that wealth as a hammer, as a weapon, to determine what their laws, to determine what their culture, to determine what their economic aspirations should actually be. The searchlight should be turned on Western nations. The searchlight should be turned on institutions who, for the sake of their own personal philosophy, LGBTQ thing agenda is a philosophy. And I'm not going to hate you if you abide that philosophy. I'm not going to hate you if you indulge in that philosophy. Yes, I hate what you do. I hate what you stand for. But that doesn't mean we can't do business with each other. I think there is a bigger agenda around this subject matter. And I think African leaders should come together to actually identify this and bring the matters, put all irons in the fire so that we can know how best we can exist outside dependency on these institutions, on these countries, and on some businesses that are bent on determining our destiny going backwards.
All right. Now, record has shown that the World Bank is one of the greatest financiers for Uganda, financing several projects, road projects, infrastructure in Uganda. And since this sanction has been placed on Uganda, it has actually affected these projects, sponsoring these projects and financing them. Now that things are turning this way, what would you expect the government of Uganda to do? Could it be a time to look inward? Do you think Uganda can survive without getting aid from World Bank? And then I also wanted to add this concern that when it comes to the issue of business or economic value, why placing priority or making reference to the issue of homosexuality when in the real sense, we're talking about projects that affect people? What would you expect henceforth from the government of Uganda to be able to mitigate the effect of this, since the World Bank is the greatest financier for Uganda?
All right, Femi, I think you should be on this side, and maybe I should be on the other side, because you have actually given a first-hand double-barrel answer to the collage of questions that you have asked. What should Uganda and some other African countries that most likely will be experiencing this, what should they resort to? First and foremost, I think there is a conspiracy of discrimination on this subject matter, because Nigeria also took the same stand, possibly with severity of punishments not that harsh as that of Uganda. But for reasons best known to the West, they didn't push this kind of propaganda against Nigeria. And you and I know the reasons that explain that decision, even though they were threats. We also know how that issue affected the elections in 2015 and affected external campaigns against the then sitting president. I don't belong to any political party. I have not voted in this country once for very, very particular reasons, so that I can maintain my neutrality when it comes to analysis. I continue to remain a political analyst. But like you rightly said, there are two ways to actually grow an economy. One is organic and one is inorganic. One is organic internally, and the other one is by going up and down, globetrotting, begging for people to come and invest in your country, people that do not have like minds, to come and invest in your country and to bring money in. Now, I bring back the case to Nigeria and bring us back to the studio right there at Soap News, and something I advocated a couple of months or weeks ago. I said, given the Nigerian situation, which almost is like the Ugandan situation when it comes to our economic trajectory and our economic transactions and our economic position as it stands today. Now, if we need to raise $100 billion in Nigeria, I can tell you that we have 100 billionaires that can borrow the Nigerian government that money. But the problem is actually the problem of the deficit of trust. Let's go back to Uganda. How best can Uganda get itself out of this rut to continue to promote and foster economic growth, stability, and development? It is actually by looking inwards and by looking for sister nations, beginning with Africa, that have like minds in philosophy and orientation with them, to come invest in their country and then do business together. This should foster trade relations between sister African nations, brother African nations, and foster that relationship that will continue to elevate our economic aspirations. Now, it seems that subject matter, the red line and the focal point here is homosexuality. rather than focusing on Homo sapiens that need economic activities to remain within the circle of survival. I agree with you on that point. But like I said, we cannot divorce morality, cultural expectations from the economics that is expected to take care of members of the society. Society is first and foremost a gathering of people that are bound together by a moral code, and that moral code gives them the basis to pursue every aspiration, economic, spiritual, political, that they want to at any point in time. So I'm hoping that the parties here will sheath their swords and look more to the benefits to humanity, to the benefit to Uganda, and let people live the way they want to live and not be cajoled into living the way other people live outside their climes.
All right. First, you asked the question why the discrimination in terms of the treatment of Uganda and Nigeria, as well as other African countries that have an anti-LGBTQ law. Well, if you check the Ugandan law and its severity, the Uganda anti-LGBTQ law, we also find that some convictions have been made, but we really can't say the same for Nigeria and some other countries. But do you think that is part of the reason why Nigeria did not face this kind of consequence, so to speak, as Uganda is facing? And then, if you look at the economic strength of Uganda, it has a lot. In agriculture, Uganda is strong, one of the biggest producers of coffee. And in terms of location, access to markets, Uganda is very vital in East Africa. Can Uganda shake off this pressure it is getting from the international community economically?
I am confident that we are arriving at the age of economic advancement in Africa. And what gives me that confidence? When we look at what our young boys are doing, young fintechs are doing in the area of technology, you would see that Africa, with respect to technology, is becoming a beacon of hope and attracting a lot of FDIs and FDIs. Foreign portfolio investments and foreign direct investments. Now, on the basis of that traction, I am much more convinced that any country that organizes itself socially, intellectually, and otherwise can make the best of its resources, put the pillars and the pegs of fiscal discipline in place, invest in the development of the human beings so that they can have a high human development index, and move themselves from whatever point they are to a desired point strategically. Now, let's come back to Uganda and the key question you asked, if they can actually pull this off. I think the answer is yes, they can pull it off. But I also think that with the avoidance of wanting to use the word compromise, because I know that this is going into the net and this is going to be there forever. I don't want to be seen to have said, to have used the word compromise. I would rather use the word diplomacy. I think shuttle diplomacy, I think a lot of diplomacy should be borrowed by the Ugandan government. And in as much as the stand is cultural, in as much as the stand is embraced by the larger population of Nigeria, of the Uganda.
Oh my. Was struggling to connect with Dr. Ken. Well, he was trying to paint a picture of how Uganda can manage this crisis.
The possibilities of Uganda
Yeah, he said
going
he didn't want
forward
to use
without
the
the
word
backing of the international
compromise, but
community.
yeah, but he said there's a need to deploy what you call diplomacy. In handling this kind of sensitive crisis, you just have to be very diplomatic. And like what the president of Uganda said, he said, if I described it as disoriented, what you call psychological disorientation, I was raising a statement as regards this development. He said he described this development as what you call psychological disorientation. And what he's trying to say is that it's an individual thing. Now, here you have a president who has consulted the stakeholders. He said before he signed it into law, he had to consult stakeholders, the activists, the lawmakers. And, when it comes to the issue of lawmaking or passing a bill, it's a game of numbers. You might have your say, but the majority will always have their way.
Carries the day.
That's why they always use the word the highs have it. When you subject that to vote, which exactly was what happened with this bill before this anti-homosexuality law was passed into, bill was passed into law. It has to go through readings like their own National Assembly, and you always have first, second, or third reading. And so this was done. He had to consult the stakeholders before it was signed into law. And once this is being passed by their own National Assembly, you also expect that the president should sign it into law, because the president doesn't have his mind of his own as a person. But it has to do the bidding of the lawmakers who have gone through this bill, consulted, who have discussed with several stakeholders. And what is so important is also to respect the sovereignty of Uganda. They've taken a decision as regards this development, and it's important for the World Bank to respect. But my concern here is like someone who asks, what is the economic value of sex orientation? What is the economic value of homosexuality? We're talking about projects that affect people here, that affects life here. Why don't we put our differences aside? Yeah, the World Bank is saying, okay, you're trying to protect the interests of people who have this kind of sexual orientation from being discriminated against. And here, on the other hand, you have Uganda saying, hey, this is against our law. So when two elephants fight, it is in this situation, it is the project that suffers. Several projects were started and they've been abandoned because the two parties there can't just sit on a table and agree. And that's what Dr. Ken is talking about. I don't understand the kind of diplomacy that Uganda is going to put into this to ensure that they see this through. But with what Museveni is saying, he's determined to ensure that even if it means they won't get aid from the World Bank, they are ready to go by what his people has voted to do. And so this is where the sovereignty of a nation is coming into play. And it's the beauty of democracy, where people decide their path or their sense of direction. And the president is, okay, I'm going with what people have decided. And here on the other hand, you have sanctions on the same country, because since this was done, several sanctions have been placed on Uganda, and it's affecting the revenue, the foreign direct investment, or the impact of foreign investment on Uganda. But this is an opportunity for Uganda to also look inward and see what they can do to jig up their revenue. And I also have this concern that why do we need to depend on external aid, external financing, all the time? I know absolutely no country can exist without not having external financing. But when you have a situation like this, it's a lesson for other African countries that we don't need to be seen begging for aids, begging for funds from World Bank, IMF, and the rest of them. I read a report where years back, a certain bank had to borrow from Nigeria. I don't want to mention the name. That was in the 1960s, certain international agents. I don't want to mention it, but it's on record. You can find out. So if that could happen, it means we can get to a level where, as a country, you can raise the right financing needed to finance all your projects. At that point, in the Committee of Nations, African nations will be respected.
Now, talking about African countries and even lessons, the Uganda situation seems to be a lesson on both sides, whether positive or negative, depending on how any other country wants to view it. For some countries that may want to push for an anti-LGBTQ law and have seen what Uganda is going through, may not want to push that for fear of suffering same fate as Uganda. Now, if you look at some of the countries may say, well, Uganda still exists and is still pushing in spite of it. If they can do it, then we too can do it. If you look at World Bank and what they're doing, you could look at it from the view of human rights. Perhaps in the thinking or the perspective, from the perspective of the World Bank, this is a human rights issue. You, just as you were asking, what is the business of sex in the economy? It's your personal orientation, regardless of what anybody thinks. Should that now be an economic matter? Should that be issue for public discourse, what people's sexual orientation is? But you find that whatever orientation you are of, it seemed like many persons are pushing it into the public space and giving it a business tone, in the sense that in some places you can't be hired if you are known not to support people with a particular orientation. And it goes other way. So it now becomes something that interferes with how business can be done and how economies can grow. Hence why it has become something that an institution like World Bank will be involved in. Ordinarily, it should not be that. But it's the nature that this issue has assumed over time that is now a thing of for and against. So if you're for it, well, you can function within certain environments and certain economies very well. If you're against it, you can't function in that. The World Bank coming to say that it aims to protect projects in Uganda. Well, that may come with conditions. If you want fundings released, if you want fundings to continue, you've got to maybe reduce the severity of this. But whether or not the Uganda government will bow to such pressure is left for time to reveal. If they are to go on to say, we do not mind the consequences, do not mind the suspension of funding, let's look inward, like Dr. Ken has said, well, they can, but the road will not be a very rosy one, but eventually they can get to. I believe that any African country with the vast resources that African countries have can grow their economy without dependence on international aid. But good news, Dr. Ken Ikewa is back and we can continue the conversation. Nice to have you back, Dr. Ken.
Yeah, sorry, I went off. I got a message from the energy company, if you know what that means, right? Speaking euphemically.
All right,
so
let's look at the role of the World Bank in this. Now, I was talking with Femi, and it seemed the perspective of the World Bank here is that this is a human rights issue, and so if you have a law that infringes on the right of some persons, then there will be economic sanctions to follow. Is this purely a human rights issue? And with the World Bank coming into it, does that look like maybe prevailing on the Uganda government to bow to pressure through conditional release of funding?
Well, let's go back to the class in philosophy, and then maybe the class in ethics, philosophy and ethics. The arguments will come from a particular space now saying this is a fundamental human right issue. I very much agree with that theory and with that paradigm. As a human being, you're free to do whatever you want to do with yourself. But your freedom should not impact the freedom. Your freedom should not impact the sensibilities of other people in the name of you exerting your fundamental human rights. Now, still on the issue of fundamental human rights, because I'm also pushing my own advocacy. As Africans, we cannot be scared of pushing the advocacy of what we stand for and what we believe. For the fact that something is legal and something is ethical, or for the fact that something is legal, okay, something may be ethical for a particular group of people, but it necessarily may not be legal. So if it is acceptable in a particular society, it doesn't mean that it should universally become a law or a right that should be acceptable and accommodated in all societies of the world. Okay, we come back to the other aspect of what you said. What should actually be done? Where I also stopped from, should there be some form of diplomacy? I think the only way we can consolidate ourselves going forward, and perhaps also look at a procedure for which and through which conditional grounds can be made for the release of funds, is to be diplomatic on the subject matter. The Ugandans can be diplomatic on the subject matter. I mean, even the Holy Script says, let those that are righteous continue with their righteousness, and let those that are unrighteous continue with their unrighteousness. The day of finality is going to come where we all are going to answer for our deeds. So, but do not let your own unrighteousness become a basis for destroying what I believe is the grounds, or what I believe is the sane basis for my own righteousness. So at the end of the day, we'll all come to the table, we'll all get diplomatic, and most importantly, we must look at the Pareto view of this, which means that the larger percentage of the Ugandan people are going to suffer. And will it be a good news for them to suffer? I don't think so. So I hope all parties involved will come to the table and move the ship forward in the benefit and in the interest of the Ugandan people.
All right. The Ugandan president has insisted there's no going back as regards this law. Now, what do you think Nigerian government is doing in the light of this development? Nigerian government seems to be also having some pressure. What do you think Uganda can learn from Nigeria as regards how Nigeria is handling its own pressure from the international community as regards this law? How would that be of lessons to Uganda as well? And how can Nigeria as well learn some lessons from what is going on, playing out between Uganda and World Bank?
Okay. What lessons can Uganda learn from Nigeria? And is Nigeria actually under any pressure? Femi, you and I know that there is really no pressure on Nigeria with respect to the LGBTQ agenda from foreign countries or from foreign institutions. There's really no pressure. No multinational has withdrawn from Nigeria, for instance, because Nigeria has a law that is anti-LGBTQ. No Nigerian, to the best of my knowledge, has been jailed for being caught in the act of any form of the LGBTQ set and frame of activities. So I would even say, to a great extent, with all of that the anti-LGBTQ law in Nigeria is an audio law. It's a law that exists on paper and is a law that can be used and can be appropriated to as a political weapon when the need arises for people to do so. I do not want to go into the cases of the cross-dressers that we're having in Nigeria today, who have become a part of our society, one of whom was my student in the university. We saw what happened to the young man or the young woman or the young she or he or her, or however we have chosen to start describing that young fellow. But I know I taught a young man that was very unserious. And today he has made himself something of a celebrity status. But for me, I will call that a yeye-brity status. In the light of that, we see that we are beginning to evolve in a
Dr.
society.
Ken, could you speak
Yes.
to the issues and let's not go into personalities?
Okay. Well, the issues are very clear. There is not much that Nigeria is supposed to learn from Uganda, because we do not actually have the pressure that the kind of pressure that Uganda is actually having. What we need to do is to also brace up to the future pressure that will come, especially within the Nigerian space, because we know that in Nigeria, there are pockets of protests that are beginning to fight for the recognition of the rights of the people in this cohort. So what we need to do is to have a strategic plan so that when this pressure would come, whether internally or externally, we can cushion the pressure and make sure that it does not have any negative multiplier effect on the Nigerian economy and the Nigerian people. As for Uganda, I cannot speak to what the stand of the president is. He has taken his stand. The country has taken their stand. The country and all its constituents may not particularly be in support of the law or that stand, but most importantly, we should be concerned about the economic survival of the country and the larger population that will be affected by the withdrawal of businesses from Uganda.
All right, let me quote the president of Uganda. He made a quite significant statement here, and I would love you to listen. He said, the problem is that, yes, you are disoriented. You have got a problem to yourself. Now, don't try to recruit others. If you try to recruit people into disorientation, they will go for you. Now, you've heard what he said, that it's a personal thing, that they shouldn't try to recruit other people. Now, what kind of orientation are you expecting from the Ugandan government as a way forward now in handling the aftermath of this crisis? What would you expect the government of Uganda to do, the kind of orientation, since this has been described as disorientation? So what kind of orientation do you think will help the people of Uganda to understand the significance of this decision and the need to respect the sovereignty of the people of Uganda as a way forward?
All right, Femi, there is a play of semantics here. The word and the usage of the word orientation, disorientation is all an interplay of semantics. Let's just break it down. If there is going to be a shift in focus and orientation, what the Ugandan government would need to do is to first and foremost give a national sensitization to the Ugandan people on why hardship may be befalling them soon and on how best to brace up for them to get out of that trap and of that situation. But two orientations are very important in this case. One is to build a deeper cultural orientation, and two is to build a growth mindset and growth orientation that will begin to harness the entire energies of the Ugandan people in the direction of mobilizing themselves despite external interferences, despite external barriers and maybe other laws, maybe other conspiracies against that country and other African countries that will still give hope to the people. Like Blessing did say, Uganda is resource rich. It's a strong power, especially in the eastern part of the continent in terms of agriculture, in terms of export of cash crops. And all of this can be brought to the fore to give a stepping stone and make a silver lighting in the whole of this cloud for Uganda. I think despite all of this oasis of the rainbow, there is hope beyond a storm that Uganda is actually facing currently.
Okay, away from Uganda, let's return to Nigeria now, where the federal government has unveiled some fiscal incentives to boost the oil and gas sector. One of them is the VAT Modification Act, which will free some energy products from VAT, and also the offshore, deep offshore oil and gas tax incentive. But let's look first at the VAT exemption for some energy products such as cooking gas, diesel, and others fall in that line. What's your thoughts?
Yes, I had a wind of that news in the wee hours of this morning. And if there's any point in time to actually celebrate any policy, any initiative, this is one that I would use possibly just one hand to clap for the president of Nigeria. And I hope that you won't accuse me of focusing on personalities now that I have mentioned the president of Nigeria.
I'm only asking why you would clap with one hand, because I know you can't clap with one hand. So why?
Okay, so why will I clap with one hand? I think that it is long in the coming. It is long in the waiting for us to have been considering ideas and initiatives like this on how best we can evolve the Nigerian economy and the business environment into one that is more insensitivized. I mean, we're in need of a lot of incentives to be able to cushion the effects of the reforms, which I criticized on another channels yesterday, on another news channel yesterday, that the reforms are good, but they didn't quite come at the time they ought to have come. It was more of putting the cat before the horse instead of the horse before the cat. So this policy, for instance, this VAT initiative and the removal and the reduction of VAT on some certain products, especially within the context of the sector in view, it's a good initiative, and it is one that is quite commendable. But why will I also clap with one hand? I have lived in a country where a lot of policies are put on paper, and the implementation of those policies are defrayed. The implementations of those policies are stifled because some people that gain from the status quo will do everything possible to make sure that those policies are not implemented. I hope that every hand will be on deck to ensure that these policies saturate the nook and cranny of the Nigerian economic space, and also that the major actors in the supply chain will begin to embrace a national conscience that will reduce the cost of living that Nigerians are having to bear at this very present time.
Right. Now, talking about these incentives, which is the aim is to see what to do to boost local production in the oil and gas industry. Now, the emphasis here is about tax incentives. What kind of tax incentives would you be expecting from the federal government if this idea is going to materialize and going to give value to that sector? What kind of tax incentives are you expecting the federal government to put in place to ensure that outrightly this will further boost the production in the oil and gas sector?
All right. I think a day or two ago, I was asked this question with respect to the strategies that the government should begin to think around and embrace to move the economy forward. And the second strategy and the second point I made was the need for us to reduce the tax burden on Nigerians, on corporate citizens, and on individual citizens in Nigeria. But before I said that, and coming back to your question, the first thing I said is that you can't sit down and condemn the bush of someone else's farm where you have not done your own clearing or your own housekeeping. I think before we start considering the issue of tax reduction and the removal of tax burdens, especially in the oil and gas sector, the first example that must be laid is for us to find ways, this present government to find ways to reduce the cost of governance. Once we are able to start with that example, it will be easy for us to bring in corporate citizens to buy into the agenda of tax incentives that are meant to push the economy forward. Now, what kind of tax incentives can be given to major players in this sector? And now this sector is divided into about three different streams. You have the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. And then you have the supply chain actors. I believe that the corporate tax in Nigeria today is quite high, on the one hand. On the other hand is the fact that besides the corporate tax, there is a multiplicity of tax. There is a multiplex of taxes that most companies in the oil and gas sector have to pay. I'll give you an example. Those that explore oil fields offshore have to pay a particular amount of tax every time a helicopter lands in their rigs. These are taxes. So these subtle indirect taxes that contribute to the pricing of products, that contribute to the quality of products, that contribute to supply chain disturbances, if looked at critically, and if they can be removed, if they can be reduced drastically by some 50 to 60 to 70%, will help the pricing situation, will help the quality situation in that sector. We now come down to the supply chain actors. So down to those that even vend the gas, vend the petrol, and vend other things that emanate from this sector to us. If we can see a reduction in some of the taxes they pay, I think it will also give them the conscience to pass on this benefit to we, the end consumers, and that will put at least a smile on the faces of Nigeria and Nigerians, and will mean that the government is actually putting everything in the fire to make sure that the present economic hardship is actually abated. These are my suggestions in that area as it concerns the oil and gas sector.
All right, quickly, in 1 minute, as we wrap up this conversation. So the incentive for the deep offshore oil and gas production, do you think it will encourage investments in Nigeria's offshore basin, which is part of the aim for providing this incentive?
There are a couple of factors that determine the attraction of investments into the country. And like I did say, I've already said, we should be aiming at foreign direct investment and not just foreign portfolio investments. You can begin to make loud all forms of policies, all forms of incentives that you are willing to give as a government. But if the political narrative does not change, the business environment will not move an inch forward. I think the most important thing is for us to give the sound political, to build a sound political climate for Nigeria and send that message to the international community that Nigeria is ready for business. It is good that we have these economic incentives, we have these tax incentives. It is good that we have infrastructure in place that will support businesses. But most importantly, I think the government should also saddle itself with the responsibility of unifying the Nigerian people and guaranteeing it to us as a social contract that all Nigerians, irrespective of tribe, religion, or tongue, will be given the opportunity to benefit and participate in the enjoyment, in the access, in the distribution, and in the appropriation of the Commonwealth of Nigeria. Once we get that political statement right, once we build that political narrative, everything I am setting will fall in place gradually. Line upon line, precept upon precept, a little over here, a little over there, and we will get Nigeria back to the promised land.
Right, Dr. Ken Ikenwa, we just have to leave this conversation here. Well said there that the Nigerian government has to walk the talk, not just the talking, but has to ensure that the implementation is done. You're aware that the oil and gas industry is very sensitive when it comes to the economy of Nigeria. And if the Nigerian government can get it right in that sector, just like you said, Nigeria will be a better place. Dr. Ken Ikenwa, we must thank you for your time and your thoughts on this development. It's Friday, so we'll say enjoy your weekend as well.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.